Good afternoon. Welcome to the TA webinar for the Flexible Housing Pool RFP. My name is Maura McCauley with the DFSS Homeless Services Division. Today, I will provide an overview of the Chicago Department of Family and Support Services, the Flexible Housing Pool, and the RFP for a Flexible Housing Pool Coordination Agency. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute. If you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat box. We will review all questions at the end of this presentation. And if you're having any technical problems at any point during the webinar, just let us know via the chat as well, and we will try to tend to those as soon as possible. DFSS serves approximately 300,000 vulnerable Chicagoans each year through a range of programs out of 8 core service areas. The Flexible Housing Pool comes out of our Homeless Services Division. DFSS launched a strategic framework in 2016 with a refreshed mission and department-wide priorities, and the Flexible Housing Pool fits nicely under all of the strategic priorities for the department. A little bit about the Homeless Services Division. At its core, our Homeless Services Division seeks to create an effective crisis response system that prevents homelessness whenever possible and rapidly returns people who experience homelessness to stable housing. Our portfolio includes a range of services and planning and coordination functions. We rely and thrive on partnerships and collaboration, and that is front and center in the Flexible Housing Pool, which we're discussing today. The Flexible Housing Pool is a tool for our system that will contribute to nearly all of the Homeless Division's strategic goals. Now I'd like to just go over the selection criteria for this RFP. There are 5 main categories that we'll be evaluating applicants on. One is the strength of your proposed program. We're very specifically looking at the way that you propose to deliver services in all of the core service functions that are outlined in the RFP. We're looking at past performance and the quality of your performance and how you use data to manage performance. Specifically in this application, we're very much, as you'll note in the applications, interested in your experience managing housing portfolios and administering rental payments and utilizing a range of subsidies with different public entities. If you don't have experience in that, again, anything relevant that would correspond to what we're looking for in this application is fine. We're looking at organizational capacity, your staffing levels, the processes that you're putting in place, and the way that your staffing pattern is comprised to reflect the diversity of communities in Chicago, and particularly people with lived experience of homelessness who will be participants in this program. We'll be looking obviously at your budgets, how you plan to utilize funding for this program. Also in the financial justification section, we're looking at your capacity as the Flexible Housing Pool scales, as we hope it will. So looking at how you might operate and manage fiscal controls within the program at the size that we're currently funded for in this RFP, and the ways that you plan to have controls and capacity in place as the project expands. And then we will, as noted in the RFP, be including an oral presentation for every applicant that passes through an initial threshold review. Just so you know, the timeline for those presentations is slated for late July, early August, and we'll get those scheduled as soon as we do that initial threshold review of applications. But that will be scored and part of your evaluation. Contracts resulting from this RFP, the contract will be a 3-year term. This is a little different from the way we normally do our contracts. We're anticipating the start date to be September 1st of this year. There's an option to renew for a maximum of 2 years based on performance and funding availability. The Flexible Housing Pool Coordination Agency that's selected through this RFP will actually be entering into a partnership agreement with all investing entities in the Flexible Housing Pool DFSS serves as the administrative lead department for the flexible housing pool and will be your primary point of contact for contract-related items, but you will be entering into an agreement with a number of partners. The initial funding level for the flexible housing pool is $1.8 million, and that's funding from DFSS, the city's Department of Planning and Development, and the Chicago Housing Authority. And agreements and scopes we anticipate may be modified if new investment partners join the flexible housing pool. So really, we're giving you notice that as you're applying, that being flexibility and ability to adjust to somewhat changing scopes over time is something that we're looking for in a partner organization. So before I dive into the core elements of the flexible housing pool and the role of the coordination agency, I'd like to give some background about Chicago's flexible housing pool development. The flexible housing pool is adapted from a successful flexible housing subsidy pool model implemented in LA County, and there's other similar models in other cities throughout the country that have been looked at as well. But essentially, a planning group comprised of partners from nonprofit organizations, Cook County public agencies, City of Chicago departments, and local hospital systems has worked for more than a year to design the scaffolding for the flexible housing pool, really the information that you see laid out in the RFP. In January, City Council passed an ordinance that allows the city to create a flexible housing pool and authorize the use of $1.8 million to launch the program. The long-term vision of the flexible housing pool includes growing the pool with a diverse cadre of investors from hospitals, healthcare systems, other public agencies, and philanthropic organizations. While the program is starting in Chicago, there is a vision to expand the flexible housing pool beyond Chicago if investors so desire. The RFP outlines the program design and requirements for the initial $1.8 million. However, we are seeking applicants that can respond to the initial scope and reflect on capacity to scale when the flexible housing pool grows in funding and in diversity of funders. So this slide really outlines the goal of the very large vision and goal of the flexible housing pool is to create cross-sector investment in integrated housing and service delivery strategies that will dramatically increase supportive housing for individuals who are impacted by homelessness and who have complex needs and a history of justice involvement. I think it's really important to state that the overall goal here is to do two things: increase supportive housing. So a large part of this program and what we're looking for through this RFP is actually the implementation of permanent supportive housing. But the other piece of this that makes it different from an RFP for a traditional permanent supportive housing program is that we're also looking to streamline administrative functions and funding functions through this coordination agency. So there are a lot of responsibilities under the housing portfolio management, fund management, and relationship management service areas of this model that are really positioning this third party to be an administrative lead in those areas for a lot of housing units of permanent supportive housing throughout the city. So very, very simply, the flexible housing pool is creating this mechanism for public and private funding sources to pool together and be joined together toward a common goal with unified, streamlined administrative and service practices. So instead of having multiple programs have to manage the different voucher requirements of multiple funders, all of the funds will be pooled into this one pool. The Flexible Housing Pool Coordination Agency will design the administrative practices, hopefully simplify them. So they will be, no matter what the funding source being used on the back end, there will be one administrative practice to apply for, get into housing, and pay landlords in the community. Our target population is high utilizers of crisis services who have high behavioral health needs, physical health needs, high rates of detention in jail, and are experiencing homelessness. Referrals will come through the coordinated entry system for this project. We are fortunate to have a strong partnership with Cook County Health and Hospital System, and they are using their data from their collaborative research unit to identify high utilizers within their members. And we are working with Chicago's Homeless Management Information System to do a data match to identify the first cohort of participants. So that will be happening on the back end, but it will still be linked to the coordinated entry system so that we're following the way people get matched to housing through our homeless system. The RFP outlines a number of performance metrics for the Housing Coordination Agency. I've just listed a few here on this page. But as we noted in the RFP, and as you'll see in the application questions, we expect this to evolve, and we're looking for input from applicants on other things that we should be tracking that would demonstrate performance for this agency. Other priorities in this RFP are that we have a series of best practices for permanent supportive housing outlined in the RFP, so we're asking that applicants make sure that those practices are infused in their program implementation plans. This is an entity that will have to have the ability to implement units citywide. So if you're interested in only working in one particular area, we're encouraging people to talk about partnerships to make sure that partners for the coordination agency have the capacity to do this citywide. And then again, as I've mentioned a few times already, just the capacity to scale your operations as the fund grows. Just getting a little bit more into detail on the service array. The housing portfolio management is really around landlord engagement and unit identification. We're asking the coordination entity to have a pool of available units at any given time, so that when we identify eligible participants, they can have a selection of housing units to look at. So this may include master leasing. It could include paying rent in advance and holding units, really because the fund is meant to be flexible. You'll be able to use funding to do those things differently than you may have in the past with strict public funding that's related to housing subsidies. We're looking for a streamlined application process that simplifies things for both the landlord and the tenant. And a key part of the housing portfolio management is having 24/7 crisis availability for landlords. Fund management, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, but it's really the management of payment of rent to landlords. There is a client assistance fund that is part of the pool. And then most importantly, ensuring the fiscal controls of this whole process. Tenancy supports, I want to clarify that the tenancy supports include pre-tenancy supports. So we're really implementing a philosophy of a whatever it takes wraparound approach to assisting people regaining stability and improving their health. So we have a number of things outlined in the RFP that are considered tenancy and pre-tenancy supports, but to clarify, the coordination agency will need to ensure that services are provided as people are identified by the data match to help them, help locate them, help them through the housing process and into housing, and then work and provide tenancy supports and services once the individual is housed in their unit to remain housed. Services can be provided by the coordination agency or via a subcontract. In this first cohort, we will be coordinating with Cook County Health and Hospital System Behavioral Health. They will provide, because all of the members in this first pool are anticipated to be county care members, so they will be able to provide a level of clinical support in coordination with the tenancy support providers. In this area, we're also interested in partnerships that include providers who have the ability to bill Medicaid for some level of tenancy support services. We recognize that not all of the services outlined in the RFP are billable, but some of them are. And through kind of the coordinated effort of the partnership involved with the flexible housing pool, we're hoping that as things change within the state, some of that will be expanded. So that's something to consider and something that we are looking for that's spelled out in our application questions. We do anticipate that will evolve over time. So it's not a 100, it's not something that's mandated, but something that's encouraged to be explored. Ideally, the pool in its full implementation will be paying for services, but only as a last resort. We're really hoping that the funds can be used primarily for subsidies, a limited array of services, and then the financial assistance that might be needed to help people move into housing or keep their housing. We are expecting the coordination agency to dedicate a full-time project manager to the flexible housing pool to be a point of contact for all partners that are involved in the project. That the coordination agency will be expected to work collaboratively with DFSS and the flexible housing pool governance structure, which I'll talk about in a minute. There will be specific performance reporting and tracking for the housing administration component and service component of the flexible housing pool. But then we are also, the partners are also interested in retaining an outside evaluator to help us evaluate the bigger system impact of the flexible housing pool for the larger system goals that are outlined in the RFP, reductions in the use and expenses of public crisis response systems, overall improvements in health outcomes for individuals who are participating in the flexible housing pool, improved housing stability and retention, and things like that. That will be kind of a second stage of the flexible housing pool. So there's really two components of data and evaluation that we're talking about in this RFP. So just to talk a little bit about the partnership structure for the flexible housing pool, as I mentioned, DFSS is the lead administrative agency per the ordinance. DFSS will staff the administrative functions of the flexible housing pool and be the primary liaison for the coordinating agency. Cook County Health and Hospital System will be providing clinical services and care coordination to the initial cohort of the flexible housing pool participants. They may also designate behavioral health providers from their network to provide some level of care in addition to the tenancy supports that are offered through the coordination agency. The flexible housing pool will have an oversight council that is comprised of investors in the pool, individuals with lived experience of homelessness, and a safety net hospital. We will be having, we are also kind of informed and advised by advisory committees that will guide the oversight council as needed on specific areas, and will include tenant groups, the Alliance for Health Equity, which is a network of hospital and health stakeholders that are interested in funding and integrating housing and services with their work. And then finally, landlord management will be a key partner in the overall structure. So in the RFP, the planning group has done a lot of work to look at other cities who've implemented similar models, and we've come up with some budget parameters that are laid out in the RFP. So what we're actually asking for in the budget portion, the budget submission, is for you to identify how you will use the funding that is in the categories of supports, housing, portfolio, and fund management. The housing costs that are listed here are fixed amounts. They're direct client support. So things like your staff and operations that might go towards housing should really fall under the bottom two categories. So just wanted to clarify that point. We're asking, the DFSS budget form is a little bit, it's like fitting a square peg into a round hole. So the application asks you to submit a budget using these parameters. I just want to clarify that the housing costs that we're putting in that housing category should just be fixed. You don't need to give a level of detail. You can just give the amount that's listed here. and then get into more detail about how you will be staffing and operating in the other two categories. And then there's a question in the application, because we're also using this, we've really moved at DFSS to also use our RFPs as an opportunity to get feedback from our partners in the community. So we're also interested in, you can use the question that asks about feedback or justification for different rates that we have listed here to explain maybe why you went outside of these parameters or did something different, or if you have evidence that there should be different costs than we've kind of identified in this, you can enter that there, but you can use that as your budget justification to explain what's outlined. So it's a little bit different of a budget response than we typically look for in our application. So I just wanted to clarify that these are parameters. This will still be negotiated at the point of contract, but some of these things will be fixed in the contract as we move forward. So some advice as you prepare your application, please start early, because this is a new concept. This is not a traditional permanent supportive housing model, as I mentioned earlier. The application it will be submitted through our eProcurement system. So if you don't already have an iSupplier account, you should get that registered and started as soon as possible. The second bullet actually doesn't apply here. Take advantage of resources available to you. My colleague Julia is going to go through a little bit of an overview of eProcurement, and we'll show you some training resources at the end of this webinar that are available for that system if you need to. Please reach out with any questions about eProcurement or about the RFP. Please read the RFP in advance and identify your application approach, so that when it comes to translating it into the application, you're really expressing the full intent of your program design and all of your experience and qualifications. Also review the application questions and make sure you fully answer all questions. There is a character limit, and so you need to, it's a little bit of a game to determine how you prepare your responses. Don't forget to attach required attachments. I think the last recommendation is please don't wait until the last minute. We recommend that you submit, no later than 24 hours in advance of the deadline. We have at times experienced glitches in the system, and we want to be able to help you work through them, but we can work through them when there's time before the deadline. We can't if you're at the deadline. So please just do that and avoid any unexpected stress. Before we get into questions about the RFP, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Julia Talbot, to just give a quick overview about the application system.
Hi, so thank you so much for joining us. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the technical assistance resources that are available to you to help you navigate the eProcurement system. The best source of advice and support that you can get is to if you have specific questions, not about the application narrative, but about just managing and navigating eProcurement, is to go to either email the eProcurement support at cityofchicago.org. Those are good questions for registering into the iSupplier, but also any kind of follow-up stuff. And then also, the OBM GMU at cityofchicago.org, or the hotline, which is 312-744-0358. And all of these email addresses and phone numbers are in the RFP document itself. We always post the webinars online, so they'll be in the webinar. So, and quite frankly, if you went to, I believe you go to the DFSS website or the OBM website, you could stumble upon these resources fairly easily. But there's the Department of Budget and Management is is basically the people that will give you the best support in terms of navigating the iSupplier / eProcurement system in terms of registration, but also navigating the application process. I have some pretty good handouts and PowerPoints I can send to you if you want to email me, and my email address is in the RFP, but it's julia.talbot, that's Talbot, at cityofchicago.org. And I can answer some questions just to help you get going. You can go to the next slide. As Maura said, start early. We can't emphasize this enough. We just went through the CDGA process, and we didn't have, it wasn't, the system didn't crash. We had a huge volume of people submitting, but I really feel like just as a general rule, if you can try to get your stuff in 24 hours in advance, that buys you some time if something happens. And that's just a general rule of thumb for any application, any deadline that you might have to come up against with the city, or really anything. Because there is not a whole lot that we can do for you at 11:45 when the RFP or the application is due at noon. And we cannot accept late applications. To accept late applications, we would have to basically void out everybody who got their stuff in on time and re-release the RFP. So there's no, so there's really no wiggle room on that. It's basically a requirement, a procurement requirement. And so being a minute late is not good enough. So we really just want you to be early, so we can help you work out those problems. And the problems are, in fact, they can be resolved. So just if you're having problems, call us early, get your stuff in early. Just in terms of managing your application and your account on eProcurement, to remember to update your agency information and user access. Enter email addresses before granting access to your organizational users if that's an issue. Assign the proper responsibilities within your organization for vouchering, for writing, etc. Maintain updated and accurate information. This system actually provides us with a lot of really good email addresses, a lot of good places for us to touch you. We can actually email you quite relatively successfully and rapidly. But if you have the wrong person in there, if that person left, if that person has a new email address, it's going to go to the wrong thing, and you're not going to get good feedback. You're not going to get the help that you need. The other thing I like to remind people is that if you do that go back button, the system usually will throw you out, and you'll have to it will save your stuff, but you'll have to re-enter, re-log in, and that's a real pain. So you really should look for how to, go back to your home page. It's taken me a long time to learn this the hard way, but really using those little arrow buttons that we all like to use really doesn't work very well on this system. This isn't a bullet, but the system also does work much better in Internet Explorer than it does in anywhere else. So the next slide. As Maura said, there's a 4,000 character limit, which means that includes punctuation and spaces. You can't say that enough. I know that it's an uncomfortable limitation for many of us, but there you go. I always like to remind people to use spell check. You might, maybe you'll get an extra character if you spell like me. One of the nice things you can do with this system is you can submit your application and later pull it back and amend it. So you can amend it, if you submit if you're like, hey, I'm not sure, I think I'm done, as long as you're still before the deadline, you can pull that proposal back and add to it, change it, upload, download, whatever you need to do, and then resubmit. And you can do that as many times as you want. So up until the deadline, submitting a proposal isn't like, something that's set in stone. And I think I said, submit early and submit often, and late applications, we just can't take them. I think that's really all I have to say. Again, if you have more specific questions, you're completely new to the eProcurement world, feel free to give me a call or drop me a line. My email address and I think my phone number are in the RFP body themselves, and I'm more than happy to help you out.
Okay, great. So just a reminder, the RFP applications are due on July 10th by 12 p.m. And with that, we will go through questions. So if you haven't entered your questions, please go ahead and do that now. So the first question is, to clarify, I'm just going to read the questions and then respond. So the first question, to clarify, the usual DFSS budget forms are not required, and we should follow the format of the budget in the RFP. We want you to use the budget form. So you have to use that form to prepare your budget, but the budget parameters that are outlined in the RFP need to be kind of fit into that format. And the best way that I can explain it is when I say that the housing costs are fixed, you could just, wherever kind of rental, leasing and rental subsidy support would be on the budget, you can just enter this, you can enter the amount that we have outlined there. We want you to use the supports section and the housing portfolio fund management section to then build out your budget within the DFSS form. You can, and then the next question is, do we have to provide the costs in the format given in the RFP per member per month, or can we submit line item costs? You can submit line item costs. This is giving you an idea of how we're planning, how we're thinking about paying for the services that you, in the budget, you should do line items that kind of add up into those categories. And then again, use the application question that talks about justification or how you are thinking about those costs to give any explanation that might not be evident by reading the budget form. So we don't have any additional questions. We can hold on for a minute or so, but if you do have questions, please enter them so we can be sure to get to them. But also feel free to contact me offline if you need further clarification on anything. Yes, so the next question says, to confirm, in the first cohort, all referrals will come from Cook County Health and Hospital System through coordinated entry system, and DFSS, CCHHS, and the coordinated entry system will work together to ensure that happens. That's correct. And I want to clarify with that, the patients will be identified through that data match. And then we have worked through with our colleagues at CCHHS kind of the process for how kind of outreach to engage and find and locate that patient would happen. And there's, if the person is currently being served by the CCHHS, they will play a role in that. If the person seems to be their primary place of activity is within the homeless system, the tenancy support services from the coordination agency would play a lead role, but coordinate with coordinated entry system components to do that identification. So the next question is, should the budget total the amount indicated of $1,232,800 for 1 year, or is the application amount flexible? You can submit a budget for $1.8 million, you know, and just include your justifications. This is an estimate of what we expect 50 participants to cost, but we know that that is going to evolve over time. The next question is, how should indirect costs be handled in the budget? You should include indirect costs according to your federally approved rate, the way you would in any budget that you submit to DFSS. And then just again, you can include your justifications in the question, the application area of the application. But indirect costs are allowed as part of this. The next question is, will there be an expectation that part of outreach would include doing a coordinated entry system assessment for patients? I actually don't have an answer to that question. I think that we are still in a position of working out how that will happen through coordinated entry. I think our goal is to align as much as possible with the system. So there will probably be some way of doing an assessment, but I think that's TBD and will be worked out with all of the partners. So the question here is, could you comment further on the role that Cook County Health and Hospital Systems care coordination and behavioral health will play with the tenancy supports outlined in the RFP? So because we anticipate that this first cohort of participants will be county care members, they will be engaged by Cook County Health and Hospital Systems care coordination. So they will go through, their kind of assessment and referral process to understand the level of care they might need in housing. I think the easiest way to say is that they will be doing more clinical support than the traditional tenancy support provider may be doing. There will have to be a coordination amongst and across the providers that are working with each participant. And I think that we, just in the conversations that we've had in our planning, like it might look different for different participants. It will also depend on who the tenancy support provider is that is working through the coordination agency. If it's also a county care behavioral health provider that can bill Medicaid, some of that might shift. So I think the easiest way to think about this is clinical behavioral health and care coordination would happen through the county services. Tenancy supports related to case management, employment, connecting to resources in the community, working, to maintain housing would be provided by the tenancy supports. And this is something that we very much expect to evolve over the course of the program as we understand how all the players will work together. So we are out of questions for the time being. So thank you all for your participation, for the questions that you did submit. Again, feel free to contact me with any additional clarifying questions about the content of the RFP, and then contact Julia or the emails from the Office of Budget Management around any eProcurement or iSupplier questions. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you.